So our first speaker is well known to many of us. For over 30 years, Peter's been working in the Bay, using his keen powers of observation and encyclopedic knowledge of San Francisco Bay ecology, history, geomorphology. The list goes on, but most importantly, about plant ecology to develop, and he used this knowledge to develop comprehensive strategies to protect and recover habitats in the region. And Peter has pioneered many of the restoration approaches that we've been using in the Bay. And he's also been very free with his ideas and helping generations of practitioners and students improve the use of ecology to increase the health of the Bay. So today we're very happy to have Peter presenting on the diversity of revegetation methods and materials, traditional, modern, and hybrid approaches. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I'd like to provide some background on revegetation methods and materials to show how some of the historical practices relate to modern applications in the Bay, and especially with living shorelines and ecological restoration of baylands as the scale of projects increases. This title slide is the only one I'm going to show with some results of revegetation. I'm really going to be focusing more on the techniques themselves. But this example at Sears Point, San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge in San Pablo Bay, illustrates some of the modern adaptation of some very effective older techniques from traditional approaches that developed pre-scientifically long before restoration for ecological objectives. I think of these as hybrid methods because they were developed basically from folk technologies, which later became professionalized. And some of them have kind of fallen off the table as the technological sophistication of revegetation has increased. The key for this project at Sears Point, which was to control severe erosion along a shoreline of a tidal restoration project, was that 2 miles of living shoreline was installed with no import of off-site grown nursery stock. We revegetated this using a combination of techniques with only on-site plant materials. And this is really important for areas where accessibility of sites is restricted or where the costs and pace of revegetation can sometimes outstrip supplies of stock. So next slide. Uh, can you advance? Thanks. This is a chatty slide. I'm not going to go through it, I promised. But what I wanted to show here is the sequence of the development of 17th to 19th century land use practices that involve revegetation. This is the origin of some of the folk technology of revegetation. That became in the 19th to 20th century more professionalized, mostly from agricultural applications, but all before restoration and before ecology was even a science. So a lot of the methods and materials we've kind of unconsciously inherited as legacies from non-restoration practices, but the basic technology is still there. An inflection point for this came from late 20th century when the Corps of Engineers began to really focus on bank stabilization and dredge sediment stabilization. And that flipped over in the 1980s with the advent of new environmental laws that required habitat mitigation. That required revegetation of new habitats, and there was no science at the time for that. So it was borrowed and adapted from all these antecedent land uses that required revegetation. And now we're in the 21st century where ecological restoration is its own science and its own industry. And this is the era of a transition to really an industry of ecological restoration that requires revegetation. Next slide, please. And I want to contrast to set up the rest of the slides the dichotomy between the urban-centered nursery-based plant production system that is really revegetation has kind of adapted to the proliferation of a network of native plant nurseries. They really started in the 1970s. Circuit Riders in the North Bay was one of the first in the state. The first in the country were in Maryland, 1972, Environmental Concern. And now native plant nursery production has become so professionally established and so scientifically refined that it really has become the center around which revegetation techniques have developed. And this is a great contribution. There have been a lot of advances for this, for revegetation. But at the same time, some of the older traditional techniques that were developed for adaptation to inaccessible sites or very large scale applications like mine reclamation or establishment of, hundreds of acres of rangeland or thousands of acres of rangeland or prairie restoration, those kind of fell away. So in remote and rural settings where commercial nurseries or native plant nurseries have limited access, the methods in these conditions, like the traditional revegetation methods, were often based on donor vegetation stands, borrowing, thinning, dividing wild plugs, bare root stock, or sod transplants from pre-established stands, usually very close to the sites where revegetation work was being done. You can think of these as field nurseries, a term that's still used. They can range from pretty much managed wild stands of vegetation that are harvested repeatedly at a very low sustainable rate, very much like the way native Californians managed sedge beds for repeat cultivation, where the harvest itself was a management tool for enhancing the vigor and viability of the populations. One of the techniques, the core techniques from the use of wild donor stands is the use of dormant winter bare root field transplants. During dormancy, plants don't have leaves. They are physiologically resilient to disturbance. The root shoot ratio is kind of balanced off because for deciduous plants, or there are no leaves, so it's very hard to get transplant shock. This is an example of a rare native hybrid oak, Oracle oak, where you can't grow them from seed because they're hybrid seed and you really can't form them. They form sporadically. The technique is simply to lift the entire root system from below with a long handled spade, push the plants up. You don't dig them out, shake off loose soil. Soil remains attached to the roots, so they are pre-inoculated with mycorrhizae, non-mycorrhizal fungi, root sheath bacteria, soil invertebrates. An entire soil community is built into the roots down to the cortex of the roots, and those are transplanted into soils of similar density and are directly packed. So the first growth of the roots as they emerge in spring is in direct contact with the matrix soil. It's a little different from plant transplanting a container-grown plant. Next slide. And that technique is also very well adapted and widely used for perennial plants, herbaceous perennials, particularly clonal plants that have naturally spreading root systems. The last example with woody plants are for taproots, where you can get a very, very large, robust taproot in at sizes that are hard to produce in containers without getting to very unwieldy large containers. Similarly, wide-spreading root and rhizome systems can be harvested from donor stands, lifted at full robust sizes from field-grown material, and directly transplanted with contact to the transplant site's soils. Again, they are pre-inoculated. And this technique was used at vast scales. Again, this is inherited from 17th century, 18th century applications in the 1920s and 30s to stabilize moving dunes, which we now want to restore, of course, in Oregon that were threatening rangelands, grazing lands. Field crews were using, again, these revived 17th, 18th century techniques to obtain donor stock of bare root transplants of both native and non-native dune stabilizing grasses, planted at incredible scales, which now are invasive species problems for us. But this is one of the examples of using native plants, which they stopped doing only because they had smaller supplies of them, something we can now overcome. And that very ancient dune stabilization technique using clonal perennial vegetation was recently used in San Francisco at Ocean Beach, where a pilot project needed to come up with a sudden urgency of a dune stable of an unstable dune that was graded without any stabilization. There was no lead time to produce plants for transplanting, so local native stands were thinned, transplanted by volunteers, with, again, no preparation at all. Unfortunately, it wasn't coupled with erosion control, so a lot of it did blow out, but the stuff that did not actually erode did quite well. The techniques are probably familiar to some of you who have used sprigs. Um, Trim the tops of this is all done during the wet season, winter. You trim the tops to adjust the root to shoot ratio so the plants don't lose too much water. If they're actively growing, you lift the plants out from below, expose intact root systems. You slice open holes, insert the sprigs, backfill and tamp them down to ensure root contact. And the speed with which you can transplant these is really, really high. Another fast, efficient method based on rhizome transplants it also works with any perennial crown-forming species, is again to lift the entire plant out with no tops or with the tops pruned off, getting down to the crowns with buds, to keep them from desiccating during handling in case there's dry weather, which you shouldn't do in winter. This all should be done in wet, dormant, cool conditions. You can dip them in mud baths, sometimes with augmented nutrients, a little fertilizer. These can be handled and directly transplanted. The buds will sprout at the same time as the roots. So again, you minimize stresses. This can also be done very rapidly because you don't have to handle individual transplants. Probably the most resilient traditional planting unit that comes from this translocation method from donor beds is to translocate whole sods or fragments of sods. Again, you either need very sharp spades, or now we have the advantage of lithium ion battery powered chainsaws, cordless chainsaws that can slice through for turf cutting, the same way people would use pasture turf cutting. And this can be used for a wide range of herbaceous uh, sod-forming species, rhizomatous species that are hard to get in containers. Here's an example of some rhizomatous species that are grown. Species are those with vegetative lateral shoots that spread like mints. Both crown-forming plants and clonal plants have this same constraint in containers of a limited shelf life. Once they reach an optimum size, they should be transplanted to the field before they start to feel the constraints of that wall of the container. If they get larger or there's a delay in transplanting time, they start to bind roots, and that can cause a delay in establishment. So bringing back this sort of omitted older technology for large scale restoration in the Bay Area. The first one I know of is when I worked on with Golden Gate National Recreation Area near a beach. Very large riparian restoration, a lot of grading all at once. There was definitely a lot of nursery production for the restoration. It was an essential component. But for some of the key species, the dominant species, it was a bulk transplanting demand all at once, and it was hard to keep up with that demand. So again, some donor stands that pre-existed on the site were thinned, and some were expanded into in-ground open beds. Some line beds were created specifically for wetland plants. You flood them once a week or a month, and they are self-maintaining. So the daily maintenance requirements are much lower for these open beds, and the quantities were huge. So instead of having to phase the work over long periods of time, a lot could be done in 1 year. Even though this is well adapted to large scale restoration, it can be shrunk down. This is a small tidal marsh and seasonal wetland restoration project at a Mill Valley school, where the school wanted the kids to do the restoration work, not the grading, of course, it's just the re-veg. But this is for multiple classes over a school schedule that, could not necessarily be timed exactly with container grown material. There was container grown material purchased from a native plant nursery for some of the species, but for a lot of the main species, they were grown by converted raised vegetable beds and donated kiddie pools for the wetland species. And I think more than 1 year of transplants were developed from their on-site beds. These are sort of like pop-up nurseries. Another larger pop-up nursery is at Orloma. I'll let Save the Bay talk more about this one. This is one of the first ones brought into San Francisco Bay. It was on an industrial site, so the soil was imported, although this you can use local soils for this, and sometimes there's an advantage for, again, microbial conservation of soil organisms. But a great diversity of almost all of the taxa needed for the horizontal levee revegetation were included in this system of donor beds. At the same time, another part of the Oroloma project needed to revegetate freshwater marsh in the treatment ponds. Again, instead of having to get a 1 to 2 year lead time to propagate the stock, we just used an on-site ditch and a crew of 3 to 4 people to directly translocate sod and transplant them on site. So again, this is sort of reverting to an adapted method of this older field nursery and donor site reliance when you need things fast and in large quantities. Again, another example, Save the Bay with the Hamilton Nursery of open bed transplants for a seasonal wetland and levee revegetation project that had a substantial component of nursery grown stock, but for the matrix plants, the dominant plants, the one that stabilize the soil needed in much larger quantities, it was fairly efficient to make these open beds that again can be repeatedly harvested over multiple years. So it's not a 1 to 1 ratio of area and then commitment of those plants. These are self-renewing beds. Next slide. Again, Save the Bay will probably want to expand more on this project, but for a 10-acre habitat transition zone or ecotone project at the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. Again, another pop-up nursery, field nursery. This one, again, was based on imported soil. So this is a cultivated version of field nurseries, raised beds, produced incredibly dense sods. Again, very hard to cut without chainsaws. The quantities, again, are very efficient for production for large scale. And this was matched by the transplanting methods, which also scaled up from horticultural manual transplanting only to farming methods, tillage. So the production of sods were included with mechanized dispersal of the fragments during dormancy. Another version of that method that again is depends on borrowing from local donor stands at a large scale. Normally we separate revegetation from grading. There's a construction contract and a separate revegetation contract. They don't necessarily have to be different. You can use earth moving equipment to do a lot of revegetation. This is part of the Sears Point project in San Pablo Bay. We had large donor stands of some of the dominant species targeted, creeping wild rye in particular, that was created by previous grading, and that's directly translocated. We also use manual transplanting. Again, in this case, we use divisions of local sod plugs to get larger plant sizes than could be easily established by either seedlings or by nursery growth, which in containers tends to restrict the size of the root systems. We were planting these at the lower end of their range, kind of at their physiological limits. We needed very tall plants to tolerate the submergence right at the edges of mud flats. And so that ended up being very successful using direct transplants. We also enhanced their survivorship by placing another traditional revegetation method using brush fencing to, this is locally harvested coyote brush that was excessive, used it to tamp down wave energy and actually facilitate the deposition of mud and seeds around plants down wave, shoreward of them. And again, this ended up being more effective than we thought because instead of disintegrating, the brush grew algae, like in Japanese seaweed culture, and it actually increased the resistance to waves. Finally, the last bulk harvest and translocation method sometimes gets a bad rep because of some limitations in the bay, is direct seed harvest and hay, distributing seeded hay, whole plants that have attached seed, sometimes sticking to them for the tari plants. the essentials for this method is that you need huge amounts of seed to overwhelm the seed densities of weeds that are there. You need to draw down the existing weed seed banks by a pretreatment, overload the system with mainly annual seeds. These are species that you can't really grow very easily in containers. You need to seed them directly. It's an annual life cycle for a cover crop, and you also need to manage the weeds afterwards. Okay, well, I covered it. Thanks for the prompts.